Recorded, classified, forgotten. This happened in plain sight. The consequences lasted for decades. These are industrial disasters that poisoned entire communities, with evidence buried in corporate logs, classified memos, and health surveys that would not reach the public for years. The contamination was real. The concealment was systematic. The pattern begins in a fishing town on the coast of Japan. In 1932, a chemical plant began discharging wastewater into Minamata Bay, Japan. The facility, operated by Chiso Chemical Company, produced acetaldehyde using a process that generated methylmercury as a byproduct. For 36 years, untreated effluent containing methylmercury flowed directly into the bay. By the early 1950s, production volumes had reached nearly 1 million tons annually, and mercury concentrations in the water rose above 10 parts per million. The first signs of trouble appeared in the spring of 1956. Local physicians in Minamata started documenting clusters of patients with unexplained neurological symptoms, including loss of coordination, blurred vision, and hearing difficulties. These cases were concentrated among fishing families living along the bay. A survey by the Kumamoto Prefectural Health Center confirmed an unusual pattern. The symptoms were not isolated incidents, but part of a growing trend. The medical team could not yet identify the cause, and the affected households relied heavily on fish and shellfish from the bay as their main food source. Plant engineers had recorded the presence of mercury in their logs, but the connection between industrial discharge and public health had not been formally acknowledged. The timeline of contamination began with a technical process, but the first clinical warning came from the observations of local doctors in 1956. These early reports would later become central evidence in understanding the origins of Minamata disease. In 1959, the Kumamoto Prefectural Health Center published a survey that cataloged the spread of unexplained neurological symptoms across Minamata's coastal villages. The survey tables showed a direct correlation between seafood consumption and the number of affected households. Among families eating locally caught fish, the rate of reported symptoms was several times higher than in neighboring inland communities. The data pointed toward a common exposure route, but the official report avoided naming a cause. Within Chiso Chemical's own records, engineers logged wastewater concentrations that repeatedly exceeded established safety thresholds. A 1959 engineering log, later entered into the prefectural archive, recorded effluent mercury levels far above what was considered acceptable by contemporary standards. Despite these findings, internal correspondence described the readings as operationally necessary, and no immediate action was taken to reduce discharges. Health officials and plant management exchanged memoranda that acknowledged the abnormal symptom patterns in the company's monitoring results, but the absence of direct attribution to industrial activity allowed both parties to delay formal intervention. The documented knowledge gap, preserved in both public survey data and confidential engineering logs, would become central to later investigations. For several years, the measured exposure remained an open secret, with institutional hesitation preventing a decisive response. Houses and schools rose directly on top of the old landfill. Beneath the lawns and playgrounds, buried drums of chemical waste leaked into the shallow groundwater. During heavy rain, water seeped through basement walls, carrying a sharp, unfamiliar odor. In living rooms and kitchens, residents noticed stains along the floorboards and a persistent chemical smell that lingered even after cleaning. Children played in yards where puddles sometimes shimmered with an oily film. At the elementary school, teachers reported headaches and nausea after recess, while maintenance staff logged recurring complaints about odors in the gym and classrooms. Logs from the Niagara Falls Department of Health document dozens of resident calls between 1974 and 1977. Parents described children returning home with rashes after playing outside. One entry, dated September 1976, records a complaint about black sludge surfacing in a backyard, followed by a request for soil testing. Health officers noted chlorinated organics detected inside several homes, particularly those closest to the canal's center. These findings were filed alongside notes describing the visible migration of waste into living spaces. For many families, the boundary between contaminated ground and daily life had disappeared. The exposure was not limited to a single event, but became part of the routine, tracked indoors on shoes, seeping into basements, and settling as dust where children lived and played. In the early 1970s, Hooker Chemical circulated an internal memorandum that described the buried waste at Love Canal as non-hazardous for the purposes of land use planning. The memo, referenced in later litigation in EPA Region 2 archives, was distributed to the company's operations, legal, and sales divisions. This classification provided a legal basis for continued residential development, even as resident complaints and health department records accumulated. The company's own documentation, cited as Exhibit A in federal court, confirmed that decision-makers had access to technical information about the waste's chemical composition. Yet the internal language minimized the risk, referring to the landfill contents as manageable and compliant with existing guidelines. When neighborhood health complaints intensified, municipal and state agencies deferred to the company's waste classification. Requests for soil testing and remediation were delayed or redirected, citing the original hazard assessment. It was not until August 1978 that the federal government intervened. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, declared Love Canal a national emergency, the first such designation under the newly enacted Superfund law. Evacuation orders covered more than 800 families, and the EPA emergency declaration cited imminent and substantial endangerment to health. The official record shows a direct line from the internal memo's language to the legal mechanisms that postponed action. The paper trail of minimization and delay became central evidence in subsequent lawsuits and congressional hearings. In December 1949, project managers at the Hanford site in Washington authorized a classified experiment known as the Green Run. The operation involved releasing a measured quantity of iodine-131 from the chemical processing facilities, bypassing standard filtration systems to observe how radioactive material dispersed in the environment. A declassified memorandum later uncovered in Department of Energy archives specified the release parameters. Over a 24-hour period, approximately 30 curies of iodine-131 were vented into the air. The stated purpose was to test airborne monitoring techniques for tracking Soviet nuclear activity, but the experiment took place without public notice or warning to local populations. Radiation monitors stationed downwind began recording elevated readings as the plume drifted east across the Columbia Basin. The path of the release extended over populated areas, including the towns of Pasco, Richland, and Kennewick. Meteorological data and field samples documented the movement of iodine-131, confirming its deposition on soil and vegetation across a broad swath of southeastern Washington. For project managers and health physicists, the Green Run provided a rare opportunity to study real-world dispersion under controlled conditions. For residents, the exposure occurred without consent or knowledge, and the results remained classified for decades. The technical data from this test would later serve as a reference point in dose reconstruction studies, but the immediate consequences were kept out of public discussion. Thyroid dose reconstruction studies at Hanford began in the early 1990s, decades after the original releases. Health physicists working under Department of Energy contracts analyzed archived meteorological records, population surveys, and internal emission logs to estimate cumulative iodine-131 exposure across southeastern Washington. The highest exposure zones, mapped in technical reports, showed average thyroid doses exceeding 100 millisieverts, levels now recognized as significant for increased cancer risk. These findings remained classified or restricted to internal review for several years, and public disclosure was delayed by declassification protocols and agency review panels. Community advocates, many of whom identified as downwinders, pressed for access to the dose data and an official health response. Congressional hearings in the late 1990s referenced the withheld studies, leading to calls for compensation and medical monitoring. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, first passed in 1978 and expanded in 1990, began processing claims from Hanford area residents only after the technical dose estimates became publicly available. By the time the first compensation petitions were approved, more than 40 years had passed since the original exposures. The pattern of delayed disclosure, protracted legal review, and late recognition of harm became a defining feature of the Hanford aftermath, echoing across other environmental disasters where institutional secrecy outlasted the initial event. Today, over 21 million Americans live within a mile of a hazardous waste site. Regulatory gaps and delayed disclosures remain common practice. The mechanisms that once concealed contamination still operate in many forms. Silence, not accident, is the enduring risk. What remains hidden shapes public health far beyond the past.